Let's also turn on the transcript. So here we are. It is April 15th, the Ides of April. Semester is quickly flown by, I'm sure, for most of us, with varying crises and problems and things we've had to tackle. So I really do appreciate you taking the time this Friday afternoon. Where I'm at again in the DC area, it's another wonderful spring day here. Well, I guess it's blurry, so you can't really see it, but trust me, it is. And I hope it's nice where you are. So let's get started. First, anyone who is there anyone here who this is their first time coming this week, or do we just have veterans here? Okay, looks like just vets. Awesome. So that means then for your pop quiz, you should all pass with flying colors. So first thing we're going to do is a review quiz, just like we did last time on the last session. So if you weren't here last session, you know, do your best. But for those of you who were here, I expect great things. I'm going to go ahead and launch this, and I'll give us a couple minutes to do it.
Jeopardy, really?
Watch you get a copyright strike on YouTube. Oh, I guess Jeopardy didn't last long. That's great. Okay, I see we're waiting for one last person. Oh, and there we go. Okay. All right, so let's end the poll now. Okay, can everyone see the results? So question one, what is the difference between a problem and an issue? Most of you got this correct. This is a tricky one. So remember, a problem is, well, it's a problem, right? It's something that's causing faculty's lives to be worse than they otherwise could be, right? Or causing their lives to suffer. While an issue, the specific kind of technical term we're using here, an issue campaign, is about a solution to that problem, okay? Now, of course, you know, option B, I suppose, you know, colloquial terms, it might perfectly be true. And then option D is, I think, also true, right? When the administration has a problem, they make it an issue for faculty. So nice work. And then question two, everyone got it right. Congratulations, nice work. So some of the primary criteria by which you determine a good organizing issue is that it's widely felt, it brings more faculty into the chapter, and there's a clear decision maker. I'm going to be talking a lot more about that today. So that's great. There are, of course, other criteria which you all worked through last time around, but those are kind of the main highlights that you want to hit. And then finally, the last question, what does the internal aspect of an organizing campaign? Answer A is correct, how the campaign grows the chapter membership and activism levels. Okay? Remember, there's an internal and an external component, rather, internal and external, right? External is the thing you're trying to achieve, the thing you want to win, the policy change, whatever it happens to be. And then there's the internal dimension, which is how is this helping us grow our chapter and grow our power, right? And if you achieve at least one of those things, your campaign will never fail, right? Even if you don't get the policy change, if what you've done is recruited 20 new members and you have 5 new faculty who are really active, that's a success, right? If you get the policy change, but you maybe don't get as many members as you wanted to get, well, then you can use that policy change as evidence in the future of why faculty should join your chapter, and it sets you up because you can put a victory behind you and a feather in your cap. So nice work. All right, so now I'm going to actually share this PowerPoint. So here we are. We've done 2 sessions so far. Session 1, if you recall, way back in, February, which is why it's like so long ago. February was about organizing kind of broadly understood theoretically, right? I bet it was a little abstract, right? What is organizing? How is it different from other kinds of mobilizing or advocacy? What is a campaign, right? What does a campaign look like at an advocacy chapter versus at a union, right? We talked about that. And then last week, we dove into issue identification, okay? How do we go about determining what things we want to campaign about, all right? So last week, we focused a lot on, what makes a good organizing issue? How's an issue different from a problem? How do you adjudicate between competing potential issues and pick which one is best? So now the next step, we have organizing issues, okay, that you all determined through the activities last week. So we're going to work off of those today in the small groups again. But the next step is, okay, now we got to actually plan a campaign, because it's wonderful to say we want to improve contract renewals for adjunct faculty as our issue, but how do you actually do that, right? How do you actually plan something for the longer term than say a week or just a month or so, right, to actually make that happen? So that's the focus for today in our 3rd session. So here's our agenda. It's pretty straightforward. We're going to review a little bit more in detail what we talked about last week. Again, given that the class, you passed your test with flying colors, right? I'm not terribly worried about this, so we won't spend a lot of time on it, but I want to review a bit just to get it back in your mind. Then we're going to talk about 3 major elements of campaign planning today. Number 1 is about goal setting. This is probably the most important thing you can do. Setting up at the outset specific goals for your campaign, both internally and externally. We'll then talk about decision makers. How do you identify who the real decision makers are who can give you what you want, right? And how do you go about influencing those people? We're going to do some power mapping activities today, which is a lot of fun. And once you have your decision maker, only then can you really start to seriously talk about what are known as tactics. Okay? And a tactic is something you all are very familiar with, even if you don't know it by that term. Okay? A tactic is an action that we take together to try to influence the decision maker to give us a thing that we want. Petitions, marches, rallies, letter writing campaigns, all those things, and of course, many, many others are tactics. Now, note tactics come at the very end of the training today. That is by design. We often, when we are confronted with a problem, rush headlong into tactics without thinking about strategy first. And then we kind of back our way into a strategy, right, after we've done a tactic or two, right? Oh, we did a rally. Oh, we did a petition. Why did we do that? We're not sure, but it seems like it's because of this, right? So tactics need to follow from your strategy. Your tactical dog or your tactical tail can't be wagging the strategic dog. It has to be the other way around. And then finally, we'll debrief, review, and prepare for next time. So that's our agenda. So first, let's start with review. To remind, and I just went over this a little bit, there's a distinction in an organizer's vocabulary between a problem and an issue. Okay, a problem is something that causes faculty to suffer. It's a specific thing that makes our lives worse. So low salaries, weak shared governance, not enough tenure track positions, the board is full of business bigwigs from around the state, right, etc. While the issue is the solution to the problem, okay? I gave the example of Bernie Sanders with a very corny impression, right? Bernie Sanders doesn't just go around the country complaining about healthcare. He certainly does that, okay? But he also has a solution that he is campaigning around, right? Which is, in his case, Medicare for all, right? And that is one of his main issues, right, is Medicare for All. It's not just going on stage and saying, gee, healthcare sucks, and then walking off, right? It's, gee, healthcare sucks, and here's what I'm going to do about it. So similarly, your chapter should have a solution to the problem. Okay? Your chapter should not just be a place for faculty to complain, although that is an important function of a chapter for sure, and you should make space for that through happy hours, listening sessions, etc. Okay, but your chapter should also be building solutions and building campaigns around those solutions. And winning a campaign has two dimensions. There's an internal dimension and an external dimension. The external dimension is wielding your chapter's power, whatever it is, to leverage that over the decision maker to get what it is you want. Okay, that's the external thing. It's outside your chapter. You're trying to win some specific improvement. And then internally, you want to grow your chapter, build membership, build leadership, build capacity, so that over time you can change the culture of your chapter from one of maybe watchdog, like we talked about in the first session, to one of organizing. So it's not just 3 or 4 faculty writing position statements every few months. Okay, you're actually developing campaigns and building leaders, so that if all the chapter leadership today decided to resign, you would feel confident that your chapter could continue, because there'd be people to take up the roles. And both of these are important. And everything we talk about, well, this says today, right? But this is in reference to last session, but also this session and the final session, right? Whenever you're thinking about organizing, you always want to have the internal and the external components in mind. How is what we're doing helping us win, but how is it also helping us grow? Okay, those two things need to go hand in hand, and they're in some way dialectical. And finally, the criteria for a good organizing issue, right? Because you're going to have competing priorities. There's going to be some huge crisis, right? Your provost resigned or was fired, or your board of trustees has a new political appointee president, or there's program cuts. They're going to destroy the philosophy department, right? They're just going to gut it. There's always going to be these crises, but you also have longer term priorities. We haven't gotten a raise in 10 years, right? The state legislature has been cutting appropriations for the last half a century, right? There's not enough tenure track positions overall, right? Shared governance has been eroded over time. Okay? So there's all these things that are competing priorities. So how do you determine which one to focus on? Well, you have to ask yourself some tough questions, and you have to make some tough choices. So you want to ask yourself questions. I'm just going to show this all at once here. You know, which of these issues will be most widely felt by faculty? Which of these issues will be deeply felt by faculty? Are there clear decision makers? Will it actually help people? Can we win the thing we want? Okay, because it's one thing to say, yes, we haven't gotten a raise in 30 years. Well, maybe not 30, let's say 10, more realistic. We haven't gotten a raise in 10 years. It's another thing to say that we can actually win 40, 50% increases, you know, to match inflation this year, or whatever crazy number it is. So there's all these questions you want to ask yourself when you are making the hard decision about what are we going to focus on, because your chapter can't focus on everything. And if you try, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, I think it's a bad quote of Sun Tzu, paraphrase of Sun Tzu, that the general who tries to defend everywhere defends nowhere, right? You have to pick your battles and focus your resources on a specific thing if you're going to hope to make progress. So that's some review on organizing issues. Any questions right now before we dive into the new content for today? I just got a question in the chat. If you missed last time, fear not. You should have received an email from me. That would have been what, April, or March 15th-ish. That has all the follow-up information, including a link to a YouTube video. And I will also, in my follow-up message from this session, send that material again, right? It's the same YouTube channel. You should be able to see it as well. But if you missed it, I can also send you a direct link too. Cullen, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I had a question about sort of at what point we should be doing research. So we might have some general sense of there's some issue with salaries or something like that, but it's hard to figure out what exactly the issue and the goals ought to be without having done research on sort of where things are right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the question, is where does the sort of research piece fit into
Yeah.
the issue setting, goal setting?
That's a really great question. I would say the research would happen in the issue identification process, somewhere near the end of that. Because what you would, and I mentioned this last time, but I should emphasize it. The issue identification process should not simply be the chapter leadership sits down for a couple hours, brainstorms some problems, comes up with some solutions, and then says, great, we're done here. Let's go for the thing that looks best. You should be engaging with members and even non-member faculty through things like surveys, right, about problems, through hosting meetings, right, chapter meetings or forums about the problems that faculty face. You should be trying to do one-on-one conversations with people, or interviewing, past Senate committee chairs. What are the big problems with the budget? What are the big problems with curriculum? That'll help you, that'll inform that discussion and that decision. And I would say once you have maybe 2 or 3 really good ones that you think are, potential candidates, when you're working through that rubric, is it winnable? Is it widely felt? Is it deeply felt? There's naturally will emerge areas where you lack knowledge, right? A question like, who's the key decision maker for this? Well, actually, we're not sure, right? And so you can put a question mark there, and that becomes an open question that your group can do research on, right, to find out more about. So I would say before you settle on your decision, you should do whatever research is necessary. And that's also a way to bring in faculty to the process. So if you have faculty who love that sort of thing, and what faculty don't love research, right? That could be a great opportunity. Love a good survey. I have some good example surveys too, if anyone's interested in issue ID surveys. Okay, so let's talk about goals. So once you have your issue identified, the next thing you got to figure out is, okay, what do we actually want to achieve here, right? What do we want to use our time, our energy, and our resources to try to win? So first, I want to begin with a broad definition of what an issue campaign really is. Okay? This is one of my patented definitions. So an issue campaign is simply, it's a sustained effort by members of the chapter to win an improvement in the lives of faculty by applying pressure through direct actions over time against a decision maker who is empowered to give you the improvement but would otherwise refuse. Okay, I think I might have brought this up last session too. Today, we're really going to focus on the second 2 of the 4 blue phrases here. Last week, we focused on the specific improvement piece. Okay, what's the actual issue? Today, we're going to focus on what is a direct action and how do you plan it and how do you make it successful, and then who the decision makers ought to be, right? Or who, just simply who are they, right? How do we identify them? And how do we identify their weaknesses, right? So that we can leverage those weaknesses to get what we want. So when you're creating goals, I'm sure everyone has seen this at some point or another. You were in some training, you were in some workshop, you were in some retreat, right? And you encountered SMART goals, okay? S-M-A-R-T. And if you haven't, well, I'm honored to be the first one to introduce you to this lovely acronym. Once you identify an issue, you got to set some goals. And when crafting your goals, you want to make sure the goals are SMART. And what that means is S is specific. Okay? We don't just want to say improve shared governance. That is not a goal. That is an ambition. That is a statement. Okay? You want to be more specific than that. What does it mean to improve shared governance based on your issue? Do you want to have more stronger committees? Do you need to have a new committee? Do you want to have a certain raise that faculty, etc.? You want to be specific. Number 2, M, measurable. Now, look, when I was in graduate school, I was very much a qualitative scholar, okay, and interpretive, if anything. cultural studies kind of guy. So I am not one to say if your goal is not quantifiable, it's not a real goal. Okay, I'm not going to say that. But you want it to be measurable in some way. And oftentimes it's easiest to measure things when we can reduce them to numbers. Okay, but that's not necessarily the case. But so you want your goal to be measurable. And what that simply means is you want to be able to say, at point in time A, before we do anything, the situation looks like this. At point in time B, after we do stuff, the situation looks different. And how do we measure that difference between those 2 points? How do we know things are different? So a very simple version of this is the policy, the university policies about how budgets are made look bad right now, and we did some stuff and now they look better. The language is different. That's a measurable improvement. Okay. At point A in time, we had 10 members. At point B in time, we now have 30 members. That's a specific improvement, a measurable specific improvement. Okay. You also want to make sure that they are achievable, A. Okay, is it actually something we can do? Again, getting back to that winnability discussion. Or is it relevant to your campaign? Okay. If your campaign is about, just to keep using this example, budget problems or lack of, let's say, lack of transparency in the budget, is a goal about, I don't know, increased undergraduate admissions, is that relevant to the issue and relevant to the campaign? Maybe not. Maybe it is if you could, maybe there's a reason. Okay, but that's not really relevant, so don't worry about it. And finally, T, time bound. This is where folks can get slipped up to. You want to make sure your goal is, there's a time frame around it. You don't just want to say, we're going to get 100 signatures on a petition. That's measurable and it's specific, but it's not time bound. Okay, you want to say we're going to get 100 signatures on a petition within 3 months. Okay, and then if that doesn't happen, then we haven't achieved our goal and we have to have a conversation about why. Okay, but that gives you a specific deadline basically to work backwards from. How many signatures do we need per week if our goal is 103 months? How many does that mean per day? How many, you see what I'm saying. So when you set goals, you want to make sure they're smart goals. Now, your campaign could have many goals at once, and in fact, it probably should. And again, I'm going to reiterate this in several ways, as you already can tell. There's internal and external components to goals. You will have goals about building your chapter internally and external goals that are about winning the issue. You also want to think different time horizons. What are some short-term goals versus long-term goals, right? If our long-term goal is to have 100 members in the AAUP chapter, well, maybe a short-term goal over the next 2 months is to recruit 10 new members to get us closer to that 100 goal, okay? Or if our long-term goal is to make sure faculty have full control over the budget, right? Unlikely to happen, but if that's your ambition, a short-term goal might be the creation of a faculty senate budget committee, okay? Because it's one step towards that. So you want to have internal and external goals, and then you break those down in terms of time horizon. Okay, what's short-term, what's long-term, what can we achieve, etc. So I'm going to give some examples of what I think are bad goals, and I want you to tell me why they're bad goals. Our goal is to increase membership. Why is that a bad goal?
Not specific.
It's not specific. It's also not measurable. It's also not time bound. It's probably actionable and it's probably relevant, right? But it's simply too vague right now. We really would want to see what's the numbers there and what's our time horizon. Okay? Now, again, it's not bad normatively. Okay, increasing membership is a good thing, but to succeed, you want to get specific. What about this one? We want to win a vote in the Senate. And also feel free to just unmute and chime in. We're a small enough group.
Again, seems to be very general and difficult to measure. I mean, what will it accomplish? It seems like there's no purpose. I mean, what will it accomplish? What is the purpose? I don't know.
So there's a few potential problems here, right? Number one is that it's not specific in terms of what that means. Now, presumably your Senate will have rules about the minimum threshold by which a vote succeeds or not. So that could give you a starting place, probably 50% plus one, I imagine. But it's potentially not relevant, right? Maybe it doesn't even matter if we win a Senate vote in our campaign, okay? It's also not time bound, it's not particularly specific. What about this one? We want to get 1,000 signatures on a petition.
It is not time bound.
Sorry, is that Christina?
Yes, I was going to say it's not time bound.
Yeah, it's not time bound. What else might be wrong with this?
It's also
Unrealistic.
not achievable.
Yeah, it's not particularly achievable. I mean, now, again, I don't want to speak for you in your chapter. Okay.
Unrealistic.
Yeah. For your chapter, maybe this is perfectly achievable, right? I would say for most advocacy chapters, 1,000 signature goal on a petition is a big ask, right? Especially if your school doesn't even have 1,000 faculty. But even in places where it does, that is a really tough thing to win. So it's not particularly realistic. It also, again, might not be relevant. Is it necessary to get 1,000 signatures to demonstrate unity and demonstrate support? Right, maybe a different number makes more sense. Now it is specific and it is measurable. Okay, but it may not be actionable, it may not be relevant. And again, it's also not time bound. What is our deadline for getting these 1,000 signatures? 10 years from now or next week? So here's just some examples of how you might make these goals better. If you want to increase membership, the goal might be we want to recruit 20 new members to the chapter by the end of the semester. This is specific, it's measurable, it's time bound, presumably it's relevant, and it's actionable. Right, it's something we can do. Instead of win a vote in Senate, we want to pass a resolution with 60% of the vote. Now, presumably, we know what the resolution is, right? We want to make sure that we understand what resolution is we're passing. But 60% gives you a goal, right? A very specific goal. It's probably above what your Senate's rules are because you want to demonstrate strong unity among faculty, right? You want more than a majority. And then 1,000 signatures, right? We want to get 50 signatures on a petition over 2 months. Should be an S there, right? Much more achievable. It's time bound. It's still specific. It's still measurable. Okay. Now, goal setting can be a real challenge. Okay, because it's I mean, you've all written, you all wrote dissertations. You all have written papers, right? Goals, timelines, deadlines. Those are just like so stressful to think about and to hold yourself accountable to and to develop, right? It's much easier to say, I'm just going to do some writing today, right? And then you sit down and write a paragraph, scroll Facebook for a couple hours, go get a nice coffee, and then your day's over, right? Maybe that was just me in graduate school. Maybe that's why I've been organizing, right? So setting goals can be a real challenge, but it's so important because as the campaign goes on, 3 months down the line, and you're scrambling and you're stuck in the details of the day-to-day, oh my God, we have to get signatures. I got to go pick up these cards. I got to order the pizza for the meeting. It's so easy to lose sight of what it is you're actually trying to do that if you set these goals ahead of time, you can come back to them later. Okay, it's been a month. Where are we on recruiting those 20 new members, right? And that can help realign you towards your goal. So to pick again on George Mason University, just because they are a useful example, George Mason University, to remind you all, was the chapter who did a campaign on transparent presidential searches. Their demand was that the faculty senate, their issue, right, that was the faculty senate should interview all finalist presidential candidates, right? There should be these public presentations, okay? So that was their issue, that was a goal, right? An external goal of theirs was, we want to win that thing. But they also had other goals. They wanted to increase membership. They wanted more leaders in the chapter. They also wanted to grow their social media. They also wanted to get a certain number of stories in local newspapers. And these all were specific. They're constructed vaguely here, right? But this is just for demonstration purposes. They had a specific membership growth number. They had a specific number of how many faculty leaders they wanted to have and a way to measure that. They said something like, we want, I think it was 50 new followers on their Twitter account, right? So they got that specific. So here's what we're going to do. Oh, actually, let me keep sharing that just so you all can see it still. Sorry about that. I'm going to break you into your small groups again. There's a couple of folks I still got to assign, which will take me just a second. They should be more or less the same groups you were in last time. And what I've done is I have taken the issues that you all settled on or came close to settling on last session. Okay? And I've created a new document, which I will link in the chat here momentarily. There's going to be 3 groups. Each group has their own tab in this document. Your mission is to go to your groups tab, and in your small groups, based on your issue, to identify 2 internal and 2 external goals for your campaign. And these need to be SMART goals, okay? Specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, time-bound. Now, the issue may not be the one that was specific to your chapter, right? You were in small groups last time. The ideas came out of your chapters, right? But you settled on one eventually. So if the person whose chapter it was is in the group, great, you can give more details. If not, feel free to just fill in the blanks, you know, assume a university that looks more or less like yours, okay? And that's okay, right? There's going to be some blanks here to fill in yourself. So I'm going to, I'm just going to show you the spreadsheet first before I post it. Here we go. So this is the spreadsheet I will share with you here in a moment. You're going to focus on this area on the top. Okay. So group 1, if you were in group 1, your issue is require a written summary of tenure and promotion decisions to be provided to the faculty member after they've gone through the tenure and promotion process. So your mission is to identify 2 internal goals for your chapter and 2 external goals for the campaign. Now, there can be more, right? If you want to come up with more goals, great. I'm not going to stop you, but I felt like 2 was probably a reasonable number. Okay. And then on the bottom here, each group has its own tab with a different issue based on what you decided last time. So group 2 is a policy for converting non-tenure track to tenure track, and group 3 is a policy that standardizes the creation of new educational programs and initiatives with faculty involvement. All right. In the chat, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being, I have no idea what you just told me, I'm very confused, and 5 is, I feel like I understand this. What is your comprehension of the instructions? And while you're putting that, I'm going to get the chat and get the thing. Okay, 4s and 5s, 4s and 5s. All right, that sounds good. So I'm going to take, let's just call that good enough. So I just put the link in chat. So feel free to go ahead and follow that. And then 2 folks came in after the start, which is Keith and Tatiana. So I will go ahead and assign you to groups. Tatiana, were you here last time? Okay, so you're going to just be coming into this. You wouldn't have been involved in the last conversation, but that's okay.
I mean, all of these issues are familiar enough, so.
Yes. So Tatiana, I'm going to put you there. All right. So I just opened up the rooms and we have 15 minutes. Sorry to cut you off there. I'm sure based on my float arounds, it seemed like y'all were really engaged in good discussions about different goals. So, but alas, we still have a lot of ground to cover. I do want to emphasize the main function of this is to give you practice with the process. So if you did not complete the entire chart, that is okay, right?
Don't lose any sleep.
Yeah, don't lose any sleep over it. But I hope what you're seeing is like just how challenging and engaging this actually needs to be, right? Because you say, well, what if we recruited 20 new members? And then you think, well, is that actually possible, right? By when do we have to do that, right? And so it kind of, just to show you kind of what this would look like if it was your actual chapter, say executive committee or organizing committee. having these conversations. All right, and so welcome back. All right, I think everyone's back now. Great. All right, so that's goals. Okay, there's a lot to talk about in goals. Let's see, where is, hang on, I'm sorry, I'm trying to share my screen again. So there's a lot to talk about in goals, and there's, you know, we could spend even more time on goals if we wanted to. There we go. Can everybody see the PowerPoint again? Sorry.
Yes.
It's being fussy for me. All right, thank you. So we have some goals, right? And of course, there's more goals to be had. But once you have your goals, the next thing you really want to focus in on is your decision makers. Okay. Who has the power to give you what you want? So we want to identify who this person is, first of all. And I say that word person, that's very intentional. Because a decision maker is a human being. Also, folks, just to remind to try to mute, it seems like it brought you all in unmuted, which is probably my fault, just to make sure there's no background noise. A decision maker is an individual, right? It's a human being of flesh and blood who has, you know, internal organs and exists in the real world. Okay, there is an actual person. You can have a decision maker that's a small group, but even in those cases, you would need to refine it down to who are the specific individuals in that group we need to influence. Okay. And this is the person or the small group of persons who have the power to give you the solution to your problem if they wanted to. But for whatever reason, in the present moment, in the status quo, they're not doing it. So we have to convince them to do it. And our job as organizers and as chapters is to apply sufficient pressure on this person through the chapter so that they give us what we want. Now, sometimes when I phrase it this way, faculty get a little tensed up and they're like, well, what are you suggesting here? Okay, because this does go against the grain, and we talked about this in the first session, does go against the grain of a lot of how we've been trained in the academy. It's all about collegiality, there's a clear hierarchy, and so rocking the boat can be very scary, right? Because in a lot of time, there have certainly been cases where faculty have lost their jobs over trying to make their campuses a better place. Okay, let's not mince words about that. But our job is to apply sufficient pressure. Okay, and again, we're not talking about wild, you know, this is not like threats or anything like that. We're just talking about collective actions. So this decision maker, this is the target of the campaign. Okay, this is the person to which all of our actions are oriented. Our mission is to get this person to give us what we want. That means making their lives a little uncomfortable for a while until they say yes to us. And so we do that through strategic direct actions, or what we call tactics. And we're going to talk about tactics in the following section from this one in detail. Okay, and these actions escalate in intensity over time. There's a reason unions, most of the time, don't begin bargaining day one of bargaining saying, well, we're done here, we're going to go on strike, so see you later. Okay, because a strike is a really intense action, and it's a very risky action. You build up to that over the course of your campaign and your bargaining cycle. And it's a last resort most of the time because you've tried everything else. That's what we're going to talk about here today, is how do you build this escalating intensity against a decision maker over time? Okay? Because our goal should be to not have to escalate. Okay? It's great if we solve our problem, right? It's great if you just go to the president and say, hey, can you stop abusing non-tenured track faculty so much? And they say, you know what? I never thought of it like that. Wow, boy, you know, like that's the ideal world. But of course, that's not the world we live in. So again, the decision maker needs to be people with names, ideally one person with a name, if you can. This person holds the power to give us what we want, as I mentioned. But also importantly, this person is influenced by other people, other organizations and other individuals who are not the faculty. Your chapter, even if you had 100% membership of faculty, your chapter might not be sufficient on its own to compel a decision maker to change their mind. Okay. You might need friends and allies, or you might need to tap into people who have other kinds of access and influence over a decision maker to get what you want. So what the next activity we're going to do is a power map, which I'll talk about more here briefly. But what we want to do is situate the decision maker in their relationships with other people and other groups, and ask ourselves, which of these other people and groups are our friends, and which of these other people and groups actually have influence over the decision maker. And that's what's called a power map. It's where you determine those relationships to think about who can we actually convince to be on our side, who has the ear of the decision maker and can actually help us here. Now, before we dive into that, a couple more points. Number one, the issue determines your decision maker. This is why it's so important to start with issue identification. Because you can't just go to campus one day and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make the president's life really difficult. Just because. Now, that might be fun and it might be satisfying right, to do that. But if it's not helping you achieve your goal of actually solving the problem, fixing the issue, fixing the problem on campus, it's not worth doing. Right? Maybe the president actually isn't the person who can give you what you want. Maybe it's the provost. Maybe it's the board of trustees. Maybe it's the governor. Okay. There's different decision makers for different issues, so it's very important to identify your issue as specifically as possible first. So here's some very common targets, some common decision makers in higher ed. University president, public enemy number one, right, for most chapters. They're your president, your chancellor, whatever they're called at your university. They're typically the highest ranking administrator who has power to make important decisions, or at least routinely makes those important decisions. There's also the chair of the board of trustees and the board of trustees itself, or board of regents, whatever your campus happens to call them. The board of trustees, in theory, has power over the president, okay? And they are, in theory, ultimately, in some if you're a public university, in some very stretched out, 5 million degrees separation from Kevin Bacon, accountable to the public, right? Because the governor appoints the board and the governor is elected, right? Or your legislature appoints the board and your legislature is elected, right? So in theory, they're accountable to the public, maybe, okay? But the board of trustees certainly has some power over a president, but also they might make some independent decisions that the president doesn't make. Okay, so you have to figure that out. If you're trying to change a policy in a faculty handbook, for example, you want to ask yourself, is it the president who can say no to this, or is it the board, or is it both? Okay, or is it a combination, right? You have to figure that out. So going back to, I believe it was Cullen's question at the start about research, this is a really important research question, is identifying your decision maker, figuring out what the lines of authority are and how to navigate them. Other common decision makers, provost, right? The highest ranking academic officer. So questions about curriculum, questions about the educational side of things often go through the provost. And the president will often just listen to and rubber stamp whatever the provost thinks. There might be a specific legislator, excuse me, maybe on a powerful committee, the appropriations committee, for example. There might be a legislative committee you have to convince, the higher education committee in your state, for example. If you're a public university, again, the governor might be a really important player here who has some decision-making authority. Or even if you're a private university, I mean, it can't hurt to get the governor or a legislator on the phone, right, to help you out. Another one that's not listed up here, but it should be, is whoever your chief financial officer is. So many university presidents just do whatever their financial officer tells them to do, right? So you have to really ask yourself, who's the decision maker here and who has the power to say yes to us? And how are they situated? So here's one version of a power map, or at least a way of visualizing a decision maker's relationships. At the center of the core, you have the decision maker themselves, and there's different rings of influence. People who have direct influence over the decision maker, indirect influence, who support them or who oppose them. And between those rings are relationships. So we might put university president in the center, and board of trustees and that first green ring, okay, as a group that has direct influence over the president. We might put the president's spouse, right, if they're also a public figure. Okay, maybe they're a big player in the community. Maybe we put the president's golf buddies, right? Maybe we put the Chamber of Commerce, right? You got to think creatively and outside the box here. Where are these relationships and who are they? So you want to ask yourself, who are the people at each ring? Do we have influence over them? Do we have access to the president's golf buddies? Maybe not, but maybe we do. Maybe we have chapter members who go to the same golf course, right? And maybe there's a friend of a friend of a friend, right? Got to ask yourself these questions. And you want to ask yourself, how do we get these people to then influence the decision maker? So just to keep running with this example, this silly example, if the president has a golf buddy who's maybe also the chair of the local Democratic Party, and there's a member of your chapter who is a big donor to the local party or a volunteer at the party, maybe they can talk to the chair of the Democratic Party and say, hey, our chapter is trying to improve the lives of adjunct faculty. The president's being a real jerk about it. Can you talk to him? Can you call him up and tell him that this really matters to you as someone who cares about your constituents in the district? Right. I'm just making this up, right? But that's just an example of the kinds of lines of relationships we got to think about. Oops. So that's one way to think about power mapping. Here's another very simple way to think about it. You have a university president or whoever your decision maker is, and you just make a scatter bubble chart of other groups and people and how are they related. So you have other administrators, staff, faculty, the Senate, the board, the community, the press, industry, donors, alumni, students, parents, right? And you start to map out who has influence over the decision maker, and then what are the relationships between these other groups, okay? Students have influence over parents, the press influences the community, the faculty have influence over the Senate and other administrators, donors have influence over alumni and vice versa. Okay. Now, your campaign may not require this. Your campaign may be very simple. Your campaign may be, we want to update the faculty handbook. The president can say yes or no to that. It's a very simple thing. The faculty senate's the main player, and your power map looks pretty straightforward. Okay. But if it's something more ambitious, right, you may want to start thinking about these broader questions and of who's related to who and how do we influence them. All right, so before we take a break, I'm going to put you all into one more set of breakout groups. Okay, and we're going to do a shorter activity. It's only going to be 10 minutes, but we're going to do a quick power map. Okay, so I'm going to bring up, and so this will be a different link. I apologize. I try to keep things to one link per week, but here we are. So this is one of these Google Jamboards, which you all love so much, that we did, I think, on the first session. Just like the spreadsheet, there are several windows here that you can scroll to on the top. There are 3 blank ones for group 1, group 2, group 3. Okay, and I've made a sample one here just to show you what this looks like. So let's assume the issue is we want to get a faculty seat on the board of trustees. That's our issue. That's our campaign. The decision maker is the chair of the board of trustees, right? The board of trustees can set their own participants. It might also be the governor or the legislator, right? But let's just assume that it's the chair. You then want to ask yourself, using the sticky note function on the left-hand side here, right, which you click and then it pops up like this, and then you type, right, and then it populates, and then you can move it around. You want to ask yourself, who has, it's a two-way graph here. You have influence on the y-axis, and this means influence over the decision maker, high and low. Who does the decision maker listen to? And then you have on the x-axis, support for our campaign and opposition to our campaign. So in the upper right quadrant are people who have high influence over the decision maker and are opposed to us. For example, other members of the board of trustees are likely going to oppose us. The university president has high influence over the chair of the board and probably opposes us. In the bottom left quadrant, you have people who support us, but don't really have much influence. The Adjunct Faculty Senate Caucus, for example, might love this campaign, but does the president really care what they have to say? Probably not. You have a graduate student union on campus, and they love your campaign. You think this is a great thing, but they kind of have some power over the president, more than the Adjunct Faculty Caucus, because the grads are a union. They could bargain, they could cause trouble, right? And then, of course, and you can figure out the rest, right? People who are low influence but opposed, and high influence and support us. Okay. So I'm going to once again break you into your breakout rooms. So the first thing you have to figure out is who's your decision maker. And if you don't know, if it's not obvious, just pick one, right? Say the university president, that's fine. And what I want you all to do is think about, on this make-believe or real campus, who are the other individuals and groups that matter, and to map them out using the sticky note function. So this is what's called power mapping. Okay. Again, scale 1 to 5. How are we feeling? 1 is, I don't understand this, and 5 is, let's do it. And yes, it'll be the same groups. And I'm going to get the link here. All right, wow, all 5s, great, perfect. So here's the link. Everybody click and follow that link, and I will put you into your breakout rooms. And we'll do this for 10 minutes. So we'll come back at 17 or 18-ish past the hour. Or sorry, 28 past the hour. All right, and Melissa, which group were you in, Melissa? I think you came out and came back.
1.
You were in group 1, great. So let me.
Yeah, for some reason, Mike, I get kicked out of the call when breakouts close. So I always have to.
Weird.
That's fine. I just come back in. So.
Okay. All right, well, there you go. Welcome back, everyone. I'm looking at your charts here, your power maps, and they look awesome. This is great. So, and again, this would be something you would do with your chapter, with your colleagues. It would be more in-depth, would have more time, blah, 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 right? But you get the idea. So the last thing then today we're going to cover in the final half hour is everyone's favorite, say it with me, tactics. Okay, you don't actually have to say it with me. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there is a bad habit in progressive organizing, and probably all organizing, I would say, probably even conservative organizing, I'm sure they have this problem too, where we rush headlong into tactics without having thought through our strategy. I mean, raise your hand if your chapter has ever, or if you've been part of an organization that something bad's happened and you say, let's have a petition. And then someone drops a petition and it exists in the ether for some amount of time, right? And maybe it eventually gets somewhere valuable, or maybe it just sits there, right? That is an example of starting a tactic without a strategy or a plan of how that tactic makes sense for what it is you're trying to achieve. Okay. So what is a tactic? What am I talking about here? Mark, is your hand raised because you have a question or because you have been part of that?
Yeah, sorry, it's because I was part of that, and that I'm inept at Zoom, so that combination.
Okay. No worries. So what is a tactic? Well, a tactic is straightforward. It's an action that we mobilize our members to do that puts some pressure on the decision maker. Okay. Think back to week 1 where we talked about the distinction between advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. Remember the distinction between mobilizing, that middle column, and organizing? Mobilizing is about getting people who agree to you to do a thing. Whereas organizing is about expanding who agrees with you and building power. But I made an important point in that first session, which is when organizing, you do still mobilize, right? But the distinction here is that under the mobilizing framework, tactics is all that there is, right? There's a thing we're asking people to do, and our true believers are going to show up and do it. Whereas in organizing, there's a thing we're asking people to do, and we're using that as an opportunity to grow the chapter, grow our membership, grow our supporters, and to put real power against a decision maker. Okay. For those of you who've been involved in any kind of collective action, you know, I'm thinking back to the uprisings of 2020, and there was in most, you know, I would say affluent areas, seems like there was a march every week, right? People will get out and march, and that's a very good thing. But to what end was often a question I would ask myself. Okay, this is like the fourth march we're having, right? And what are we trying to pressure the police department, the city council? Are we just trying to get a good press event? And those are all potentially very good answers to the question, but it wasn't always clear. Like, you know, again, I didn't organize these things myself, right? So I'm sure I'm sure the organizers behind it had very good answers. But just as an example of sometimes we kind of just default to old tactics without thinking them through. Now, tactics can be varied. There is a whole universe of possibilities. And again, just like how your decision maker is determined by your issue, your tactics are determined by your decision maker. What things is the decision maker going to be influenced by? If your decision maker, if your university president, for example, could not care less about what the AAUP as an organization thinks about him or her, a censure or a strongly worded letter from AAUP National isn't going to do much. Okay, but maybe they really care about public scrutiny and press because they want to make sure they get enough undergraduates to apply each year, and they don't want to have bad stories in national media. So press becomes a very powerful tactic in that case, right? So your tactics are determined by your decision maker, just like your decision maker is determined by your issue. And this is getting ahead of ourselves to next session, but the tactic is often the thing we ask faculty to do when we talk to them. Will you join us? Will you sign this petition? Will you come to the rally? Will you do whatever? And again, tactics need to follow from your strategy. They should support your strategy. They should not be the strategy. So really resist the temptation, and it's going to be hard. I'm telling you now, it's going to be hard. You're going to go back to your chapter. You're going to be all excited to start organizing. You're going to get your executive committee together, plus some others, some fellow travelers, and you're going to say, let's organize. And the first thing someone's going to say is, well, let's do a vote in the Senate or an open letter. And you got to say, that's wonderful, Chuck, but let's slow our roll here and let's start with strategy, okay? So resist the temptation to begin with tactics. But of course, this is the open question. Well, what tactics should we use? Just like it's an open question, which issue should we pick, right? There's competing priorities. There's competing possibilities about which tactics we should pick. So here are some of the considerations for what makes a good tactic. Is it relevant to your issue? Okay, if your issue is, to use one of the examples here, a pathway for non-tenure track faculty to become tenure track faculty, a tactic where you, a tactic where you host some kind of festival on campus may not be the best tactic. Right? I'm just making something up, right? It has to be relevant. So maybe an open letter or a petition or a Senate resolution or something else makes more sense. Or maybe there's an adjunct specific event where you want to, have adjuncts speak out about the challenges they face, right? Also, will the tactic actually put pressure on the decision maker? This is why it's so important to do that power map and to think about who your decision maker is, because different decision makers are going to be influenced by different things. Some really care about public perception and their not their identity. I'm thinking about their reputation. Sorry, their reputations. Some are really influenced by the bottom line, right? If this is going to start costing them money, they're going to really care about it. Some of them really do at least care about the perception of a nice collegial relationship with faculty, and that's something they don't want to see threatened. This is just to give an example, real world example. University of Minnesota Twin Cities has a big advocacy chapter, and they have a president who is one of these people who really wants to be seen as a good person, white liberal, right? Really wants, gives to charity, talks the good talk about shared governance. And so when budget cuts came down the line, the chapter knew this about her, that she really cared about her image and cared about being perceived as working with faculty and doing the right thing. So the chapter was able to develop their own budget proposal and came to the Senate and did a big campaign, and she accepted it because she wanted to be seen as doing the right thing, right? So that was just one example. You want to ask yourself, will the tactic bring in more faculty than it alienates? Thinking back to the example of a union. This is one of the reasons a union does not begin bargaining by declaring impasse and going on strike on the first day. Not only because it's unlikely to succeed, but also that's going to probably make more members angry than it excites. There's of course going to be the people in your chapter, sociologists, humanities people, I'm looking at you, who are going to want to go full pedal to the metal, radicalism day one, and I love your energy. But you want to ask yourself, what tactics will bring in more faculty than alienate them? Okay? You want to get people comfortable with direct action over time. You also want to, ideally your tactic leverages your numbers. This is why the strongly worded letter by the executive committee of your chapter is not a particularly effective tactic most of the time, because it's not really demonstrating your numbers. It's not demonstrating solidarity across faculty. It's demonstrating the 5 people who are really involved in your chapter have an opinion, okay? But is it really demonstrating collective strength? And just like with goals, can you measure the tactic's success? Thinking back to the example of the petition, just saying, let's have a petition, and then it just exists out there and signatures get put on it. But do you have a goal? Do you have a signature goal? Do you have a timeline for when you want those signatures? Do you have a plan for delivering that petition to the decision maker so that they actually feel the pressure, right? So you want to be able to measure the success of your tactics. If you want to have a rally, for example, outside the administrative building, that's a great tactic. How will you know it's been successful? How many people do you want to show up to this rally, right? Because nothing is worse than no rally than a rally with too few people. Right? If you've ever been to one of those, just as an example. And finally, will the tactic be fun? This is actually quite an important consideration. Organizing solidarity is experienced emotionally first, okay? As organizers, I'm guilty of this, and you as leaders, I'm sure, can understand this. We often get tied up in the data and the questions like, who's coming to this and what's our goal and blah, 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 and those kind of, technical things. But we often forget that this should be fun and joyful, and people find solidarity and find meaning in these connections they're making, and they're fighting for something they care about. So it should be fun, okay? You can make a petition fun, you can make a rally fun, you can make a Senate meeting fun. If you can, that may be hard to believe, but it's possible. So here are some specific examples for low pressure, medium pressure, and high pressure tactics. Low pressure, starter tactics, chapter's first tactics. Everyone wears a button. Everyone gets an AAUP button, or you try to distribute AAUP buttons to a certain number of faculty, and you all try to wear it on the same day. Social media posts, strongly worded letters, everyone's favorite. A Senate resolution introduced by the chapter. You ask members to include a slide in their next classroom lecture about the issue. You have a meeting with the administration to talk about the issue. You do some outreach to community allies. You ask them to publish a letter. Hey, student government, we're trying to pass this resolution in the Senate that's going to make faculty's lives better. Will you endorse it in student government? Okay, for example. So you start there, right? You start with smaller level tactics. And if those don't work, if those don't get you what you want, then you move on to the higher pressure. Then you have a petition with a certain goal of signatures that you hand deliver to your decision maker, right? A group of 5 or 6 faculty walk into the president's office. Here's our petition. It's got 500 signatures. We demand, we need you to do this, okay? Maybe you coordinate an action in the Senate, right? You have senators yield their time to members to yell at the provost or whatever it is you want to do. You can go to the press. Maybe you could do a banner drop on campus. You get a letter from the community, from allies, from donors. You coordinate testimony at a Board of Trustees meeting. I was part of this when I was at Oregon. The faculty there organized They had enough people on the docket for the Board of Trustees public comment period that they stretched the public comments out from 20 minutes to 2 hours. And they did it all through the correct process, right? It was tense, right? But it wasn't hostile, okay? That's an example. Until then you finally, if those don't work, then you got to think about your high pressure tactics. Informational pickets, where you're picketing, you're not striking, but you're picketing and you're distributing leaflets. You have a rally outside the president's home. During the pandemic, a chapter did a car rally where they drove around the block a few times at the president's house, honking and with signs. If you're a union, you can, of course, threaten a work stoppage. You can disrupt the Board of Trustees meeting, be a bit more aggressive, a vote of no confidence. Faculty often have a hard time filling in the space between a strongly worded letter and a vote of no confidence, right? Those are like the two possibilities that are within the imagination. Like, well, we're going to do a resolution. Well, that didn't work. Guess we got to do a vote of no confidence, right? Vote of no confidence is a pretty intense thing to do. And to do it right and do it well takes a lot of work. So think about what comes between. Maybe you get the governor to call your president, or you go to the national media, you go to Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, of course. These are just some examples of tactics. Another way to think about this is this is a more abstract list, right? But in terms of the kinds of things that are more or less intense. You know, at the low level, you have conversation, persuasion, flattery, maybe trying to appeal to the interests of the decision maker. Hey, you know, this thing we want to see change is actually good for the university. It's gonna show academic excellence on these metrics. And they love that word, academic excellence, right? And then level 2, that's where you get more disruptive. There's some real consequences for the decision maker, some shame, some embarrassment. And then finally, level 3 is, you know, this is like the big guns, right? Revenue impact, withdrawing of labor, fears of employment for the decision maker, right? We're going to get you fired if you don't do what we want, right? As examples. So why do we want to start small? Why do we want to begin with low-level actions? Well, first of all, it's often all you're going to have the capacity to do. Okay, which isn't to say that you don't have great ambitions, but if your chapter is 10 people, you're not going to be able to do a massive rally on campus. Maybe you could do a petition where you get 50 signatures. That's possible, right? It also demonstrates reasonability. You want to be able to tell faculty and the community that we tried asking, right? We did try going through the correct processes. We tried to play nice and they still wouldn't do it, right? We really tried to be reasonable and it still didn't happen. It also gets members used to taking action. If the first thing you ask someone is, hey, will you go on strike tomorrow? They're not going to do it. Well, most cases, 99% of the people won't do it. So you start with, hey, will you wear this button to class that says, I love AAUP, or that says, you know, fairness to adjuncts or whatever. So you start lower because it gets people then used to the idea of taking action. It builds their confidence so that at the end of it, if they do have to take a serious action, they're more prepared to do so. It also gives you the opportunity to assess your progress over time. All right, the button thing, we got 100 faculty to wear buttons. That was our goal. Hurrah, hurrah, we did the thing. We tried to have a rally. Ooh, our goal was 150 people showing up at this rally. Only 40 people came. That's a problem. Why did that happen? So it gives you a chance to assess yourself over time, right? To see if you're being successful and to regroup as necessary. This is also very important. The decision maker will know more is coming. If they don't say yes when you're playing nice, they know they're going to have a problem on their hands. The example I like to use here is the chapter at Fairfield University, which is an advocacy chapter, but they basically act like a union because they've built enough power over time that the administration thinks it's in their own interest to bargain with the advocacy chapter over wages. It's not worth their time to fight that because they know faculty are going to cause real problems if they don't engage with, it's actually with their Senate, but the chapter basically runs the Senate in Fairfield. So that's just one example. So if there's like a soft threat that like if you don't give it to us now, we're going to have to go to the press or we're going to have to do something else, right? That helps. So here's what basic campaign chart. This is an abstract chart. X-axis, we have time. Y-axis, we have intensity. Okay. So over time, your intensity increases. You start at the bottom left. You have first tactic, second tactic. Okay, we then assess our progress. How are we doing as a decision maker budging? Are we getting what we want? Are we building membership? Are we achieving those goals? Remember the goals we set at the start of this training? Are we working towards the goals? And then you keep escalating until finally you resolve the issue. Did you win or not? And again, even if you don't win the external piece, the policy change, maybe you won on your internal goals, right? This is why it's so important to start with goals so you can actually assess your progress over time. If our goal was 50 new members by the end of the semester, after our first two tactics, our buttons wearing and our rally, how many new members have we recruited? Are we on track to achieving that goal? And if not, why not? And do we have to change the goal? This is a little blurry, I apologize, not the greatest image. This is a specific escalation chart for the George Mason presidential search campaign. So again, x-axis time, y-axis intensity, or they call it capacity here, but really it's intensity. So they started in June of 2019 and ended in February of 2020, right before the pandemic. So they started with the president resigned. The chapter wrote a letter requesting an open search. Whoa, big surprise. That didn't convince the board of trustees to do it. They launched their campaign. They have faculty sign a resolution, a Senate resolution. 300 faculty signed it, calling for a public search. They then pass the resolution after they get 300 faculty to sign it. There's then a petition. The work group then passes another resolution about faculty engagement in the search. They then deliver it. There's a rally. They have a Dear Candidate rally where they rally about the candidates. They then get two big news stories. They then table at a general faculty meeting outside, the chapter tables outside the meeting to talk about the presidential search, to talk about the chapter. They then do a letter writing campaign where faculty write letters directly to the board of trustees. And at the end of it, what they won is faculty senators were invited to meetings with the 4 finalists. Is it a public search? Not quite. It's not quite what they wanted, but it's an improvement. Okay. So they won in part their external goal, and then internally, as I mentioned before, their chapter grew from 20-ish members to over 100 at the end of this. They got their social media followers, etc. So this is an example of this is a campaign before you. This is an issue campaign, right? And you can see the specific tactics they did over time. And it's not like these are totally out of the box. What did they do? They had a letter, a resolution, a petition, a rally. They tabled, and I think that's all of it, right? Oh, another cool thing they did here in December 2019 is delivers resolution and public search to the Board of Visitors. So they brought their petition and resolution to the Board of Trustees meeting, and they actually they had a friend in the administrative staff, and the chapter was able to say, hey, can you put this resolution in the board members' packets? And they did it, right? They just did it. So when the board members came to the meeting, they opened up the packet and right there was the AAUP petition and resolution. You might not have that access, but it's an example of getting creative. And then the pandemic hit and it all fell apart, but they had a victory. Not to keep tooting their horn, but I think it's worth blowing a little bit longer. Here's some examples of memes they had from the campaign. Memes are a tactic, right? It's communications. It's about building social media presence. So, you can see here the faculty handbook, the Board of Visitors and Search Committee, it's in the grave. The heaviest object in the universe, the Board of Visitors' obsession with secrecy. And then this one, which is these action figures, I guess, protecting themselves from spaghetti. I guess if you're familiar with Dragon Ball Z, I think that's what that is. You might get this more. Those are just some examples, right? Now, we don't have, unfortunately, a lot of time to start digging into tactics. But if you, on that first link I sent, which I'll share again, sorry, I'm going to go back to here. Where did it go? That first link, that first spreadsheet, there was a separate section for tactics, and we might get back to it at our next session. I don't know if we're going to have time, unfortunately, today, but if you want to look at it yourself, you can. And what we were going to do was brainstorm some tactics and then put them along an escalation chart, right? Least intense to most intense. So as you're maybe leave today's meeting, today's session, today's training, think about, for your issue, what are some tactics that would make sense? Right, so I'm looking at group 1, or let's try group 3. They haven't gotten a lot of love yet. Creating a policy that standardizes the creation of educational programs and initiatives. Okay, what are some tactics that might make sense? Maybe a good tactic for that, because it's about policy, would be getting a resolution signed by X number of faculty and bring that resolution to the Senate. That's a tactic. Okay. Maybe a few others. Maybe you can think of others. So I'm sorry we don't have time for the breakout room. As ever, time slips away. We're all mortal. Death will find us all. But I have a couple last points here, and then we can use the last few minutes to just have a conversation and have a questions and answers. I'm going to present to you here, which again, you'll have this slide, so don't feel like you got to write it all down. An issue campaign summarized. The first thing you got to do is identify a widely and deeply felt problem among faculty, amongst other criteria, but these are probably the most important. And this should take some time. You should engage your members, have a survey, have a meeting or two, okay, to really think, to find out what is it that's a big problem we could try to solve. You then determine a solution to that problem, a specific solution. That solution is your issue. Okay. You then identify who on campus can give you that solution. Who is the person who is empowered to make that decision? It might be a small group, it might be an individual, right? But even in the case of a small group, identify who those people are. Those are your decision makers. Okay. You want to then think about how can you leverage your members, your allies, your friends, even your foes to put pressure on that decision maker. How do we get them to squeal a little bit, to put it bluntly, to give us what we want? You then create a plan where you think about your tactics and you put those on a timeline. Maybe your campaign will take a semester. Maybe it'll take a month. Maybe it'll take 6 months. Maybe it'll take a year. Maybe it's a long haul. It's going to be 2 or 3 years. Okay? It's all going to depend on what your issue is and how you're going to win it. You want to determine which tactics you will use and win, and establishing measurable goals for those tactics. After each tactic, assess your progress. How are we doing? Did we succeed? Is the decision maker budging? How are they responding? Just a side note, if your decision maker responds to your tactic in some way, that means it's working. So if you do a petition and your president then issues a letter to all, uses their big listserv and sends it to all people on the campus that says, a small group of radical faculty disrupted blah, 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 and they're non-collegial, whatever. That means it's working. That means you're getting under their skin. You compelled a response. If they ignore you, that means you have no power and it's not working, right? And finally, you win, or maybe not win, or half win, or whatever. Okay. But this is an issue campaign. Okay, get your issue, find a solution, or get what's your problem, what's your solution, who can give it to you, what do we need to do to put pressure on that person to give it to us. Now we're getting way ahead of ourselves here, but you want to think about it. What happens after the campaign? Okay. You always want to think about what comes next. So whether you win, whether you lose, whether you half win, you always want to think about how do we continue growing and building our organization. So these are questions that you should talk about with your leadership after a campaign is over. And the temptation is going to be, I'm exhausted, I never want to think about this again, right? But I really encourage you to take the time. Ask yourself, did our membership grow? Do we have more activists? What do we want to do next? How do we publicize our success and claim our victories, right? It's oftentimes the work of chapters goes unacknowledged by faculty or the public, right? So how do we publicize this? If you made friends with other organizations, you want to keep in touch with them, hold events, and most importantly is to maintain momentum. Okay. Organizing does ebb and flow. It's like a sine wave, right? You peak and then everyone's tired, and then you peak and then everyone's tired, right? But you want to maintain some level of consistency, and that can be really challenging. But the nice thing is, issue campaigns are the way you maintain that consistency. Okay? Because after a campaign is over, you probably have a good idea of another thing you can try to tackle. And then you do another campaign, and another campaign, and another campaign, until campaigning is in the blood of your chapter, and it's just everything you do. Last slide here before we'll wrap up. Here's some basic tools that are very useful for advocacy chapters where you probably don't have a lot of money, right? You certainly can't hire any staff, and paying for professional subscription services is maybe even also out of reach. Canva, if you're not familiar, is a great way to make flyers, graphics, memes. It's basically like free Photoshop, browser-based. There's, of course, professional versions you can pay for if you want to, but if you just need to make a flyer, if you're having a faculty happy hour, go to Canva. Action Network is a great organizing tool. This allows you to build email databases, send petitions, and open letters. It has a great feature where you can plug in the email addresses of your decision maker and populate a form letter that you can send to faculty. So they don't got to do any of that work. They just got to type a little bit of the letter, right? Or make adjustments, sign it, click, boom, it's sent. Okay. They have it for legislators, governors. You can put in your own people. It's great. They also have petitions through Action Network that you can use. They have strong petition software to help manage a petition. And then, of course, Meme Generator. It's a quick and easy thing, right? All those George Mason memes, go back to those. These were all made on Meme Generator, okay? So those are some very basic tools you can use. Next time, I realize I've talked a lot here for the last few minutes. Next time, or I should summarize here. So today we talked about strategy. We talked about how to set internal and external goals for your chapter and your campaign, how to identify decision makers and their weak points, and we talked a bit, not enough, but a bit about tactics, how to pressure the decision maker. Next session, and our final session, if you can believe it, our final session is going to be about how to actually succeed in these tactics. Because it's one thing to say, hell yeah, we're going to get 100% signatures on the petition. Another thing to actually do it, right? How do you actually do that? Or how do you get people to come to a rally? Or how do you get people to join the chapter? This is going to scare some of you. The only answer is you have to talk to them. Talking to colleagues, talking to coworkers is the essence of organizing. You can't do it just by email or social media. Those have a place, they're important. What ultimately matters at the end of the day is talking to people. So next session, we're going to spend the entire session learning the skills of talking to people and how to coordinate outreach. Because it's not as easy as it sounds, right? Actually having a conversation with somebody where you ask them to join the chapter, it can be hard, and it's a real skill to build. So our next session, Friday, May 13th, 3 to 5 p.m. as per our habit. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now.